Hi again then guys, and welcome to another specific breakdown of an individual car from the 1.25 patch, and this time a fan favourite in a general sense, but not so much one for racing generally. In the real world, of course, just like the Mini, it is an icon, for good reason, one of the best selling cars of all time, and if you consider all of the different variations, the different facelifts right up until today, it's actually one of the longest running cars of all time, alongside stuff like the Morgan. Now, the car is of course the Beetle, the classic Volkswagen Beetle, but it's not the vintage Beetle which we used to have in Gran Turismo. In fact, that was the first one to be featured. I believe it was 1949 Beetle with the split rear window. This is the later version, which was, I believe, in all of its appearances, definitely in Gran Turismo 6, a premium car. And of course in GT6 you could dechrome it, you could fit it with a ducktail wing, you could even fit it with a kind of ridiculous looking Porsche style rear wing, which of course is kind of appropriate but didn't really suit the car. You would have needed a pretty large body kit and some other mods to really make that look appropriate. But stuff like dechroming a Beetle is always a good idea. As far as I'm concerned, I think it looks fantastic. I personally really like what Forza used to do with that, where you could fit a roof rack as well. It really suits the car. But the ironic thing, I think, that really stood out to me more than anything else about this Beetle returning now to the franchise, is that in a weird sort of way, although it's significantly newer than the non-premium split-window vintage version, it kind of occupies the same place in the game that one used to have. Because in GT6, this Beetle was significantly better than the vintage version. The vintage one could be tuned up to a certain degree, but it wasn't all that quick. Whereas this one could be tuned up to, I think it was something like 180, 190 horsepower, something like that, and even more torque, and the performance was actually pretty good in its own little way. It was a lot of fun, could take on some lower level sports cars, and it looked the part as well because of the visual upgrades, plus the fact that it was a premium was cool as well. So in some ways I would say that it's better now. For instance, the Livery Editor allowing us to do stuff like two-tone paint, as I have here, which is something that I always like to do to the Beetle if I can, but at the same time you can't dechrome it anymore, you can't have the ducktail wing, and crucially, most importantly in terms of performance for sure, you cannot upgrade it anywhere near as much as you could in GT6. In fact, it's running around half the power. In fully tuned form, it puts out less than 100 horses, and of course, if you've been around on the channel earlier on today, at least, we did a drift tune for it. It's very good at that, kind of too good, sometimes even without drift tuning, but with 100 horsepower, it's not exactly a dominating race machine. So in a funny kind of way, it really has taken over the position of the vintage Beetle, which you couldn't really use for racing that much, but it was a cool car to own. Now, to be clear, that's not to say that you cannot race this one. I already know some of you guys actually quite like the performance on this car. You find it quite sprightly in its own little 100 horsepower way, and of course having 100 horsepower, especially in a lightweight classic, is never a bad thing. That's a really decent amount of power to have if you compare it, for instance, to real life. Something like Fiat Panda 100 HP, one of my personal favourite hot hatches, it's only got that amount of power anyway, but it's still considered to be one of the most fun hatchbacks you can buy. In a similar way, in the real world, a 100 horsepower classic Beetle would feel great, and it would definitely feel fast. In the game though, 100 horsepower is not that much to be working with, so unfortunately it falls in a similar category for the most part to stuff like the Samba Bus and the Fiat 500, because although it is quicker than those two, or at least I'm pretty sure it is, I haven't actually put them head to head, it's the kind of car which, because N100 technically is kind of a lie, as all of the classes are, because you can take the power higher than that, if N100 actually was authentic, and it literally meant you could not have more than 100 horsepower, then it would be perfect, because 98 horsepower is right on the limit, and the performance would be really good against any of the other cars in the game with that kind of power. But of course that's not the case. N100 cars can go up to about 146 horsepower. So it doesn't stand a chance, because although 40 horsepower sounds like nothing in the higher level classes like a supercar or a prototype or a formula car, in this kind of level that's a world of difference. So on the one hand, yes, you do have a car which feels much quicker than stock, with around 33 horsepower to begin with, 61 pound-feet of torque, and it's not heavy. 780 kilos is not heavy at all, thankfully, because it doesn't really have the power to lug around much more weight. But even in that fully tuned form, it's much more about the fun factor and just having what I would call a quick little car rather than a fast one. There is kind of a difference. You can have a car that feels fun and, as I said earlier, quite sprightly, like this one does, or like a K car does, or a classic Mini, but that doesn't mean it's going to be a dominating race car. I mean, if you think of it this way, even the Mini, which I love, it's easily the best handling car out of the whole 1.25 patch, but even that car, which does have around 145 horsepower, still cannot beat something like a Honda S660. It's still around 3 or 4 seconds slower. So what chance does this have with 40, or in fact close to 50 horsepower less? It just doesn't stand a chance. So overall, it's the kind of car that I would definitely recommend checking out if you are a collector. If you love classics, of course if you love the Beetle, chances are you've already got one. The price is only 40 grand, which makes it even cheaper than the Mini anyway. And on a slight bit of kind of pointless trivia, this is a very strange occasion in GT6 in particular where the in-game specs are completely wrong when it comes to this car. The quoted weight in the dealership is something like 11 or 1200 kilos when it actually weighs 780, so I'm not sure what they were doing there. It's certainly not a 1.3 ton car, but that's an interesting little trivia point. Thankfully now it is listed correctly, and I think it's an interesting scenario where this Beetle has changed around quite a bit. It's occupied the place that its predecessor used to have in terms of being a great little classic collector's piece with a ton of charm, fun handling for sure, when tuned correctly at least, but not a huge amount of racing use. If you and all of your buddies in the room, or if the room itself is geared in such a way that it only allows 100 horsepower or less, or barely over it, then it could compete. But anything above that, you're going to start to notice it struggling very quickly. For instance, when you're tuning with a 5-speed gearbox, fully tuned power, fully tuned weight, it still struggles to pass speeds of like 110 to 120. It can get there, but it takes a lot longer than most of the other cars in N100. So if you want to check out something that's certainly a lot of fun, it's a great little drift car, and it's charming. Of course it is, that's one of the reasons why it's such an icon, then sure, check it out. 40 grand is not very much to spend. You can tune it up with relatively few mileage points, but if you're looking to race it, well, of course, hold your horses on that. You could try to race it if you want to, and under certain circumstances it could be capable of winning, but don't put all of your hopes on it, especially not against cars which are actually at the peak of N100. But that's it for this pick overall. Of course, I'll see you guys next time, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.